Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. I've talked a lot on this podcast about cybersecurity, but if you have ever wanted proof of just how big an issue it's becoming, here it is. New research from McGrathNicol shows 35% of Australian companies have suffered a ransomware attack. A staggering 83% of those businesses went on to pay a ransom to have their computer systems unlocked or their stolen data returned or deleted. Darren Hopkins and Shane Bell are cyber partners at McGrathNicol Advisory, which is a supporter of this podcast. Darren, Shane, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
Shane, when you did this survey, were you surprised by how many companies had actually been hit? I thought that number was incredible.
A little, Sean. I think for us, there's always been official statistics and anecdotal statistics. We obviously spend a lot of time at the coalface on incidents, and so we were pretty alert to the fact that these ransomware attacks are pretty common, and that's what's come through in the statistics, a bit ahead of perhaps some of the official statistics. So I was a little surprised, but also not surprised, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. I suppose many of us outside the industry just aren't aware of how prevalent it is, Shane.
That's true. I think for those in the industry, and particularly for those like Darren and myself who spend a lot of time, every single week for most of the year working with organisations that are suffering these types of events, we certainly know that they're a very common occurrence across the business landscape in Australia.
Yeah. Darren, what type of ransomware attacks were these companies experiencing? What were the attackers actually doing?
Well, that's a difficult one to actually quantify. When we're looking at ransomware, we often look at call it the threat actor group, the group responsible for it. And each of those groups has their own type of ransomware or software or kit that they use. And they also have their own methods of attack. And what we did see was a pretty even cross-section of most of the large groups, being representative in the statistics that came through. Look, ultimately, what we are seeing, which is quite interesting, is that the attacks that the companies are experiencing are changing. We're seeing an evolution all the time of the attackers working out what worked and what didn't work and updating their actual processes themselves and adjusting the way they attack business to be more successful. And even in the last 2 months, we've now started to deal with ransomware attacks that we may have to change their name because there was actually no ransom software. There was no malware injected into the business. They just got into a business and they spent some time working out how to destroy all of their systems. And they leave a password encrypted backup behind, but it's very non-traditional in that, you don't have a page saying you've got a countdown timer and you need to pay this ransom.
Yeah.
The threat actor contacts you directly and says, hey, you need the password to restore. Let's have a conversation.
Well, it just seems that it's very difficult to get ahead of the curve on this one, Darren. There are plenty of people out there who are prepared to undertake this criminal activity, and we always seem to be chasing our tail a bit.
Yeah, look, it's true. We get asked to help businesses put together playbooks. Can you help us guide us through a process when a ransomware occurs? And it's really difficult because there is no standard process. There are things that you need to do for sure. But every time we've done one, and we do a lot of ransomwares, I think we've got 3 on at the moment that our teams are working on at this point. All 3 are very different. All 3 have different requirements around how you respond. And all of the companies involved in these 3 have a very different path they're going down at the moment because of what's happened to them. It's very difficult.
Shane, what's the average ransom that businesses pay?
The stats on this get a little murky, Sean, but we can see from the research that we've just done that on average, the cost was about $1 million. So I think we had 1 in 4 respondents said that they'd paid less than $500,000. We had 1 in 5 thereabouts that had paid between 500 and $1 million, and then 1 in 3 paid over $1 million. So I think that averages out at over $1 million, which is quite high. I think some of the other stats that I'd seen through the industry were around that $600,000 to $800,000 mark. So it's quite significant sums.
Why do they pay it? Is it just because they can't operate unless they pay it?
I think that was the line of thought that a lot of people were gravitating towards, although I'm inclined in what's come through in the research to think a little differently, and that is that ransomware has evolved to be an extortion play, and so it's become less about the operability or the inoperability of systems and more about reputation and the risk of harm. So reputation for an organisation that's going through a ransomware event, they're very alert to that. And so that's one of the key motivating factors. But then equally, the risk of harm to customers, employees, or to the business. That seems to be a pretty key motivational driver for organisations that are weighing up the to pay or not to pay equation.
The public relations aspect of it is obviously increasingly important. I think that's what you're saying. When I read the report, what I found interesting was that notwithstanding that so many people have been attacked by ransomware, if one of their suppliers, for example, would be attacked by ransomware, there wasn't a lot of sort of empathy with that, because the respondents to the survey actually said, yeah, we probably wouldn't trust our suppliers quite as much if they'd have been attacked by ransomware.
It is a little ironic, isn't it, that we can have this scenario where it's don't judge me too harshly, but I may judge others a little harshly. But what's become really apparent in this field of cybersecurity, and Darren and I have watched this grow over the span of our careers, some 20 plus years, it does play out much more publicly now. Yeah. And there is a bit of victim shaming that goes on within the cybersecurity sphere, where the assumption made by people, if you read about a ransomware attack in the paper, is that they actually have poor security, which isn't always the case at all.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Stay with me. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to Darren Hopkins and Shane Bell, partners at McGrathNicol Advisory. Darren, what about insurance? Are many companies using ransomware insurance? Does it work? It must be expensive, I'd imagine.
Look, it's a good question, Sean. Most of the work we're doing is actually on the back of someone being insured, where an insurance policy triggers, and one of the things you get access to is its expertise and support to help you. So on that bit, people who have got the ransomware coverage will generally get help in getting through the problem. As far as the actual ransom covered, then that's an interesting one. Not always is the answer. Some policies absolutely have a quite clear coverage for you paying a ransom payment and recovering that payment you've made as part of your policy, but there is certainly some fine print that people should be aware of. One thing we're seeing pop up all the time now is that there's some fine print on a lot of policies that says that they won't pay if the ransom was subject to a sanctioned entity. So that means that the threat actor group that's done this is on a sanction list somewhere. Now, that's difficult to determine, and often that does mean that in some countries, that threat actor group has effectively been considered a terrorist. Now, I know that some of the ransoms that we have seen paid from the groups that have paid them are absolutely on those lists. And a lot of businesses would not have even thought that they have to go off and work out who attacked them before they get that particular type of coverage.
So what's the normal timeline after the attack? How quickly does it go from initial incident to a payment being made? Is it hours or is it months?
I think the stats in the survey sort of indicated that 48 hours sort of seems to be when a lot of these payments are being made. We've seen a lot of payments made for different reasons. And 48 hours seems to be about as fast as you could probably do this. By the time you've worked out what's happened, you've worked out who's doing it and the amount. And more so, the process is then to determine, are they honestly able to give us what we want back, not just paying money for the sake of it with no guarantee. If you want to then talk to them and try to obviously shrink the payment, it can go into weeks. So I've seen anywhere from 48 hours to sort of 3 weeks being about the most between a payment being made.
So Darren, you can actually negotiate the amount.
You absolutely can. You can reduce the amount that you pay through a negotiation. You are actually talking to real people.
Right.
The way this actually works is the ransom note that most people see on their desktop actually has a link, and that link goes to a location on the dark web somewhere, which is where the threat actor group has their, let's call it their web page. Mm-hmm. When you put in that code that comes with your ransom note, that connects you to a private page between your company and the threat actor, so that you can actually have a chat with them. And they've actually got a chat function like, most of those websites, if we shopping website, you pop up a little boxes down on the right-hand corner for you to chat with someone. That's available. And that is actually a real person you'll be talking to. When you're negotiating, there's a range of things that you are talking to them about. You're trying to get some proof of what they've taken. You want to try to understand, did they take my information and what information they took? They'll often give you a list of what they've taken to prove that. They'll send you screenshots of what they've taken. They'll want to give you confidence that they are honestly in a position to hold you to ransom because they've got your material. During that time, you will also be able to determine whether or not they can undo the ransomware. So can they unencrypt your data? And there's a process that you can talk to them about that. And then finally, of course, you can talk to them about price.
Yeah.
There's a risk there, though, and some of the statistics we've seen, and even on some of the matters we've worked on, there's an issue called re-extortion that can come up. And the real risk is that if you push too hard and you get too much of a discount, the chance of re-extortion goes up. And there's a whole lot of statistics that sit around should I pay, and what's the chance of re-extorting, and are they going to be
It's
honest?
game theory.
It is. And how honest are these criminals? It's such a ridiculous sort of thought to have.
So I remember reading a story, I think it was the big pipeline down the east coast of the US last year. And the problem is once they actually paid their ransomware to get the pipeline flowing again, it took weeks and weeks. And in the end, they worked out a way around, and the actual owner of the pipeline worked a way around it before it actually got operating again. How big is the issue that you can talk to the people who are extorting you and they say, well, this is what you need to do to clean your systems? How confident can you be that they're being honest in that?
Interesting. During a negotiation, there are particular businesses whose whole job is to negotiate on your behalf, and they have statistics that go to each of the threat actors. For instance, I've been in a meeting where I was subject to a conversation about a threat actor where they said, look, 100% honest, these guys. In the 120 odd ransomwares we've seen of these guys, they have never gone back on their word. So therefore, we should consider them honest. You're still dealing with criminals.
Honour among thieves here.
It is crazy. But you've got to remember too that for these groups, one of the things that they want to do is they want people to think if they pay a ransom, they will get their data back because the likelihood then of you paying is higher. And the last thing they want to do is just be seen to be just dishonest, because then the decision to pay or not to pay is actually quite easy. It's, well, we can't trust them in any event, so why would we ever pay? Whereas at the moment, a lot of these groups have got themselves to the point where it's likely you'll get a tool to get your data back. It's likely they won't release your data to the dark net, and it's likely that you won't have a harm issue beyond what you've already got. And that's sort of, I guess, what you're paying for is a higher chance of not making it worse.
It's kind of like having really high credit quality or something like that. It's sort of, you can, I'm not quite sure. I'm interested, Shane, in where these attacks are actually coming from.
That's one of the $1 million questions, Sean, I have to say. And as anything where intelligence is an important part of combating the threat, and cyber is no different in that world, cyber intelligence is a really important aspect of understanding the landscape and the marketplace and the threat actors and tradecraft and all this terminology that I still get to use even though I'm no longer in the military. It's mostly Eastern Bloc, Russian countries, affiliate programs. That's where, for the most part, you can see a lot of this activity coming from. Certainly the main ransomware operators seem to operate from those jurisdictions. Affiliates, so think of it as like a franchisee type arrangement where there's a group that own the ransomware and then there's people that sign up to use the ransomware. They're the little sort of sub-gangs, if you like, the affiliates.
Wow.
That's, again, mostly out of those regions, but it's really based on, the infrastructure that they're using to execute it. So when you can see how that attack lands in a person's environment, it's an IP address that allows you to be able to understand where that's come from. And, and I won't get into the technical specifics, but a lot of the IP addresses that we see seem to be coming from that part of the world. Now, There is very small amounts of commentary that are starting to contemplate whether there's something more sinister at play for highly sensitive information, whether there's things like nation-state threat actors that are sort of subcontracting ransomware operators to be able to steal the IP, make some money out of it, then pass the IP off to nation-state. That is still early days in terms of how mainstream that type of intelligence is.
Okay. And do they target businesses that are data rich, or do they target businesses that are rich, full stop?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different motivators behind that, and therefore why an organisation might get attacked. The most basic of that is that it's unsophisticated, and it's because you've got vulnerabilities in your environment, i.e. your IT hygiene hasn't quite kept up to speed. The vulnerability exists and you're unlucky. That's a pretty common attack on an organisation. So that's indiscriminate of, size or sector or anything like that. That's just whether you've got good IT or bad IT in place. There are obviously more sophisticated attacks that'll look to do, big game hunting or whale hunting, they call it out there. I don't advocate for any of those things, game hunting or whale hunting, but that's the terminology that's used, obviously, which is about a sophisticated attack on a large organisation because the payday could be significant. So those types of attacks occur as well, and they'll be organisations that are data rich, money rich, or if it plays out publicly, has a bit of a hacktivism type of element to it.
Yep. Okay. So, it sounds to me that you can never be 100% sure that you can prevent ransomware, but what should companies be doing, Shane, to prepare themselves?
Well, we talk to businesses of all shapes and sizes, and I like it that the Australian cybersecurity community isn't just focusing on big publicly listed companies and providing advice there and focusing on small, medium enterprise and businesses of that size. It's about having good IT hygiene. It's a term I mentioned before. You need to be able to do the basics really well and very regularly. It's no set and forget with cybersecurity. So we often talk about, patching systems. It's easy to fall out of a routine on patching vulnerabilities on systems. How many people get the alert on their iPhone that says Apple's released an update and you go, I'll do it later.
Yep.
You need to not get into that habit with some of the basics. And then you sort of build into a cybersecurity program where your focus is on resilience. One of the core components of resilience that's become increasingly important in a ransomware type of event is your ability to respond and recover. So you need to be able to withstand what's happening, but get out the other side.
Yep.
And so this is where I sort of use some of my military experience to talk to my clients about the fact that, I navigated ships for a lot of years in the military, and there was no chance that I was ever allowed to sail that ship off a wharf alongside in Sydney without extensive planning, months of planning, knowing what you needed to do. And people need to think about cybersecurity that way. Lots of planning, lots of training, lots of rehearsing. You need to get out the other side. So it's not if, but when, and you need to put a lot of effort into your training.
Okay, and one final one, Darren. Does paying a ransom make a company more susceptible to being targeted again because the infiltrators know that they'll pay?
Well, look, it really depends on where the company landed. One thing is if they've paid a ransom, these honest criminals that we were talking about, they're less likely to want to come back and have another go at you. It's obviously part of their reputation they're preserving. But quite clearly, if you've been found to pay a ransom, other groups will see you as a target because they know that you are willing to actually make that payment. What's really important, and to Shane's point, we're talking about what should businesses do. It's what you do after the ransomware event that's going to really be the important factor that will reduce the risk. So most businesses will exit a ransomware event, with systems back up and running to some degree. They may have paid, they may not have, and they should have a program of work around remediation. So how do we stop this from happening again? What do we need to do? And did we actually find out how they got in? The expectation is you spend a lot of time making sure that you remove yourself as being a target. Mm-hmm. I would say 90% of the ransomwares we've dealt with could have been quite easily prevented with some basic changes to their systems, or as to Shane said, some good hygiene in the way that they look after them. That's the majority of those attacks could have been defeated quite quickly. And that's the real key piece there. But I have actually seen some clients who didn't go down that path and have been hit 3 times. And we often talk to clients, and I had one in particular, and this is a worst case scenario for a ransomware event. The business ended up in an insolvency event. They had lost everything and they were unable to rebuild their systems. And they weren't able to pay the ransom because their IT person had decided to delete the notes. For that particular group, that was it. There was nowhere to go and they were unable to recover at all.
I don't think we're ending this on a high note, but it's been a fascinating conversation nonetheless, and I've learned a lot. Darren and Shane, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
That was Darren Hopkins and Shane Bell, cyber partners at McGrathNicol Advisory and supporters of this podcast. This is a Fear and Greed daily interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.